This is an overview of Chapter 27, Fiscal Policy. We will talk about what is fiscal policy, what are the effects of fiscal policy on real GDP, the policy and how it relates to aggregate demand, and we will talk about government purchases. We'll talk a little bit about deficit, surplus, and the federal government debt. We will not take a closer look about tax multipliers. So we'll cover some of these, but not all of these. One of the questions asked at the top of the book was, part of the funding for the project to expand the Caldecott Tunnel in Northern California came from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, often known as a stimulus bill, which President Barack Obama and Congress enacted in early 2009 in an attempt to increase aggregate demand during a recession. The ARRA is an example of discretionary fiscal policy aimed at increasing real GDP and employment. A majority of economists agree that increased government spending leads to increased employment, but some argue that it merely shifts employment from one group of workers to another without increasing total employment. What would you do with $500? So, it's a good question. Suppose the federal government announces that it will immediately mail you and everyone else in the economy a $500 tax rebate. In addition, you would expect that in future years your taxes will also be $500 less than they would have otherwise been. See if you can answer the questions. How will you respond to this increase in your disposable income? What effect will this tax rebate likely have on equilibrium real GDP in the short run? All right, let's define fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is changes in the federal taxes and purchases that are intended to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. This fiscal policy is controlled by Congress and the President, whereas monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve. What is fiscal policy and what isn't it? Economists typically use the term fiscal policy to refer only to the actions of the federal government. State and local governments sometimes change their taxing and spending policies to aid their local economies, but they are not fiscal policy actions because they are not intended to affect the national economy. Remember, we're thinking about the U.S. as a whole. Automatic stabilizers versus discretionary policy. So some things that are automatic stabilizers are government spending and taxes that automatically increase or decrease along with the business cycle. The word automatic in this case refers to the fact that these changes in the types of spending and taxes will happen without any government interaction. Discretionary fiscal policy is government takes action to change spending and taxes. Federal government expenditures include purchases plus all other federal spending. In addition to purchases, there are three categories of federal government expenditures. Interest on the national debt, which represents payments to holders of bonds and that the federal government has issued to borrow money. Grants to state and local government, which are payments made by the federal government to support government activity at the state and local level. And transfer payments, which include Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, programs to aid the poor, and the largest and fastest growing category. This category, transfer payments, is the largest and fastest growing category of federal expenditures. So let's look at total government expenditures as a percentage of GDP. The federal government's share of total government expenditure. Until the Great Depression of the 1930s, the majority of government spending in the United States occurred at the state and local level. After World War II, the federal government's share of total expenditures has been between 2/3 and 3/4 of all government expenditures. Federal purchases and expenditures as a percentage of GDP. So after the passage of Medicare, total expenditures by the government have been on a consistent rise. Well, there's a little dip here during a recession, but it continued to go up during the recession of 2007 to 2009. In about 2000, that other recession that kind of happened, total expenditures went down. But this is government purchases of goods or services. So again, passage of Medicare. This means way more government spending is consistent of more and more transfer payments. As a fraction of GDP, the government's purchases of goods and services has been declining since the Korea War in the 1950s. Total expenditures by the government, including transfer payments, as a fraction of GDP slowly rose from the 50s to the early 90s, fell between 92 and 2001, and was on the rise again. The recession of 2007 and 9 and the slow recovery followed led to a surge in federal government expenditures, causing them to rise to their highest levels as a percentage of GDP since World War II. Okay, what is the government spending their money on? This is from 2010. 46.6% was to transfer payments. 22.1% was to defense spending. 14.4% was to state and local grants. 7.6% was to interest payments, and other was 9.4%. The 22.1 federal budget spending on everything else the federal government does, from paying FBI salaries to operating national parks to supporting scientific research, which makes up 9.4%. In addition to purchases, there are three other categories: interest on the debt, grants, and transfer payments. Transfer payments rose from 25% of federal expenditures in the 60s to 46.6% and will continue to rise. Where does the government get money from? So the government gets money from taxing. So we spend money on those things in the previous slide. We get money from taxing. 36.9% of tax is from individual income taxes. Social insurance is Medicare and Social Security, which is 40% of the revenue collected. 13.6% is corporate taxation. People go crazy when they hear this number, but you have to remember what percentage of all the businesses are actually corporations. A very small percentage is making up 13.6% of all tax revenue. Anybody who owns a partnership, an LLC that's a partnership or a single member, a Schedule C, which is a small business, anybody who's not paying corporate taxes would pay business taxes inside individual income taxes. And then we have other sources of revenue, which is 9.6%. So payroll taxes to fund Social Security and Medicare rose from less than 10% of the federal revenue to 40% in 2010. And 9.6% of the revenue were raised from excise tax, tariffs on imports, and other sources. Is Social Security and Medicare a fiscal time bomb? Good question. Social Security and Medicare programs have been very successful in reducing poverty among elderly Americans, but in recent years, the ability of the government to finance current promises has been called into doubt. Falling birth rates after 1965 have meant long-run problems for Social Security, as the number of workers per retiree has continually declined, and the baby boomers are just starting to retire. Congress has attempted to deal with this problem by raising the age to receive the full benefits from 65 to 67 and by increasing payroll taxes. The long-term financial situation for Medicare is even a greater cause for concern than Social Security. As Americans live longer and as new and expensive medical procedures are developed, the projected expenditures under the Medicare program will eventually far outstrip projected tax revenues. Social Security and Medicare spending as a percentage of GDP. They predict that it will be more than 25% of all GDP. I bet you it's actually predicted to be more. I'll see if I can pull up a new one. Explain how fiscal policy affects aggregate demand and how the government can use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. Okay. Here's what happened. So, if we feel that there is a recession, they would order expansionary fiscal policy. They would increase government spending, which of course would increase GDP, or cut taxes, which should increase consumption, therefore increase GDP. Real GDP and price levels will rise. If we fear inflation, we would actually have contractionary fiscal policy. We would decrease government spending or raise taxes, or both, and real GDP and the price levels fall. The table isolates the effects of fiscal policy by holding constant monetary policy and all other variables. In other words, we are again invoking ceteris paribus condition. A contractionary fiscal policy would cause the price level to rise less than, because we've been having inflation, right? So I do want to talk about what a budget deficit is, and a budget deficit is a situation in which government expenditures are greater than its tax revenue. This is for a year. A budget surplus is a situation in which government expenditures are less than its tax revenue. So this is a surplus. Surplus 60s, surplus 2001. So discretionary fiscal policy can increase the federal budget deficit during recessions by increasing spending or cutting taxes to increase aggregate demand. Most of the increase in the federal budget deficit during a typical recession takes place without Congress or President taking action, but is instead due to the automatic stabilizer. Deficits occur automatically for these two reasons. During a recession, wages and profits fall, causing government tax revenue to fall. Because again, we have a percentage and we have a progressive tax, which means as you earn more, you pay more as a percentage. So if you're earning less, they're raising less money in government taxes. And then the government automatically increases its spending on transfer payments because we automatically cover unemployment, and and so therefore transfer payments or welfare or things like that because you lost your job would automatically kick in. So there's no vote. Congress doesn't go to vote on this. This just happens. Cyclically adjusted budget deficit or surplus is the deficit or surplus of the federal government's budget if the economy were at potential GDP. So, should there always be a balanced federal budget? Many economists believe that a good idea for the federal government to have a balanced budget when the economy is at potential GDP. But few economists believe that the federal government should attempt to balance its budget every year because it might have to take actions that would destabilize the economy. Some economists argue that the federal government should normally run a deficit even at potential GDP. Conflicting statements. The federal government debt as a percentage of GDP. So before World War I, before World War II, and then so it is almost at 100%. It spikes to its highest levels since 1947. The federal government is not in danger of defaulting on its debt because it can raise the funds it needs through taxes or spending cuts to make the interest payments on its debt, which are usually about 10% of the total federal expenditures. If an increasing debt drives up interest rates, crowding out of investment spending may occur, which lowers capital stock in the long run and reduces the capacity of the economy to produce goods. This effect is somewhat offset by the government's debt, which was incurred to finance improvements in infrastructure, bridges, highways, ports, finance education, or research and development. Do you think government debt is a problem? I'm not going to cover this. And that's where we're going to end on fiscal policy.